Mentioned part 2 will be a very dark and sad overall. Could you explain to us why, if you didn't play FF7, the end of Disc 1, right? Disc 1 and Disc 2 are some of the best, like, content in video games, right? Disc 2 is arguable, like, some of people's, like, favorite, what's it called? RPG content of all time for Final Fantasy VII, right? It's got so much stuff that starts coming to a head and so many different locations that you go to and so many things are happening to characters that it's fucking crazy. Disc 3 is sort of like a wrap-up disc at the end of Final Fantasy VII Original, where you just sort of polish up some rest of the things in the planet that can be utilized at that moment, and then you finish the game. Disc 2, however, is the proper middle part of a trilogy in many ways, which is where I think that they can really expand from Disc 2 to, like, Disc 3. We're getting into some heavy prediction territory as far as where this whole thing is going way in the future, okay? I'm talking way in the future. Disc 2 traditionally ends at Aerith, right? With what happens to Aerith. And I don't think that's where you do it. The dev specifically said popular trilogies where the second movie is the most beloved. And if you start thinking about what he's talking about, if you start really thinking about what the devs are talking about, how, like, is the Two Towers the most beloved of the Lord of the Rings trilogy? Is Back to the Future 2 the most beloved of the Back to the Future trilogy? Right? Is Matrix Reloaded the most beloved of that trilogy? You can't just think of, like, anything like Shrek or Kung Fu Panda or anything, or Terminator. No, those movies aren't technically trilogies, right? Like, they kind of are. Men in Black 2? Yeah, sure. The one that clearly makes the most sense is Star Wars. And not talking about new Star Wars, like older Star Wars. The most beloved sequel. People are saying, like, Aliens. I'm like, no, dude, the Aliens was never designed to be a trilogy. And there's more Aliens movies after Aliens. The Dark Knight's a good call, right? That's a good call because the Nolan trilogy of Batman is a thing. The thing that makes the most sense that he's talking about, number one, I think he's referring to Empire Strikes Back, because Final Fantasy VII is already very much a Star Wars kind of adventure in many ways, instead of being exactly a Star Wars adventure, which is Final Fantasy 12. FF7 already has a lot of nods to that stuff, right? Between obviously Biggs and Wedge and all that shit, which is through a whole bunch of stuff. There's a couple of things that make a lot of sense why Part 2 is the Empire Strikes Back of Final Fantasy VII Remake, at least Rebirth. The setup to what eventually is happening is super important. When you eventually get to the top of the planet, right, you're confronted with Sephiroth. He's essentially been guiding you there the whole time. You're a puppet. And you are forced to do his bidding, and you give him the most powerful weapon on the planet, the Black Materia, which will summon the great calamity from the sky. Everyone's dead, right? At this point, everybody's dead. That happens, right? Not everybody dies, but Cloud retroactively is a puppet of Sephiroth. And at that point, the entire party's disbanded. Everyone's thrown to different areas. Shinra is sort of thrown into aloof as well. And Cloud is gone. This is sounding kind of familiar, right? Anybody seen the end of Star Wars? Anybody remember how, like, you're confronted with the main bad guy? You learn a big reveal that you're kind of a puppet, that he's your father, you know, in Star Wars. The main hero, or one of the most beloved heroes, Han Solo, is stuck in carbonite, seemingly gone. The exact same thing happens to Cloud at that part of the story. Everything is really dour and everything's, like, really sad, right? Tifa is essentially the Luke in this situation, where the only hope that's left is a couple of the hero characters to get the job done. That's the end. That's the end of, like, the Empire Strikes Back of Rebirth. But what makes the next movie? Well, obviously in the next movie, what do? They get a team together. They go find Cloud. They break out of prison. The world's gonna die, but now we have an airship. Let's go kick some ass and let's go find our friend. We know he's still alive. It's like it's almost following a beat for beat sort of like moment that sets up for something super epic, because part 3 is most likely going to be a giant epic of you, like, globe-trotting in an airship and looking for kaijus, looking for all the weapons that the Earth has set upon you to stop Genova. So to me, those beats set up like perfectly. Like that just makes, there's too many things that make so much sense as far as like how the eventual setup is going to be and how sad part 2 is going to be. Part 2 is definitely going to be the one that everybody likes, just because like also disc 2, which is a lot of part 2, is also the one that everybody likes. So that'll be up to them to make part 3 really good, right? And what's the way you make part 3 fucking sick? How do you make part 3 better than part 2 of Final Fantasy VII? How do you make the 3rd chapter eclipse the 2nd chapter? Make it all about finding Cloud, getting him back, restoring his memory. We're back, baby. Let's go kick some ass. And now on the planet is all these ridiculous creatures, these giant weapons that are roaming around, and we have to take them out. But guess what? We're too weak to take them out. There's no way we can stop these giant hundreds of foot tall creatures that are trying to like stop the Earth from being destroyed. What does the party have to do? What do you do in the original game, right? You have to start thinking like, what did we do back then? You couldn't just go fight the Ruby weapon. You couldn't just go fight Emerald. You couldn't just go do whatever you wanted. And you can just I'm just gonna pull up to Ultimate Weapon and beat his ass. No. You grind. You didn't grind. You didn't go get enemy skill. If you think about what you do, you visit the ancient caves littered throughout the world. You breed chocobos to travel to those places all around the world. Now your globetrotting adventure becomes a search for the knowledge of the ancients. So now that is part 3. Now we're like, now that what's it called? A character is gone that has no connection to the Cetra or the ancients anymore. Now we have to find a way to make a connection with them to go find all of the crazy ass materia that is like across the planet that'll help us fight these giant things, if not potentially save us from Sephiroth. And of course, Knights of the Round will be a part of that, right? Of course, that's like the one thing we predicted a few years ago is that, man, yeah, Knights of the Round should not be a side quest. Knights of the Round and chocobo breeding and doing all this stuff to go find this stuff should not be a side quest. That should be part of the story, right? I want to know the story of Knights of the Round, right? It was always a super weird thing that you're in this world of Final Fantasy VII that very much has these mythical creatures and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, like, what is it, 15, 13, something, all these knights show up to beat the shit out of somebody. It's like, what is going on? This always felt really out of place way back in the day. I think it's the best opportunity for them to actually make the Knights of the Round like a proper, really cool, like explained, like weapon of the Cetra type of thing that they utilize to fight off Genova or some shit. Or they tried. So, I don't know. I think learning more about the Cetra and what happened back when Genova first fell to the planet would be pretty fucking cool. And to me, that feels like where they're setting that shit up. Part 3 will all be about that. And that's how you expand like a part 3 to make it something way more than what, you know, disc 3 was in FF7 original, and to have it feel super unique. That's my preference. And really, it's unique, but is it that much different than what you actually do in the original game? It's not. It's just that there was a choice in the original game. In the original game, yeah, you know you can't fight the most buff dudes on the planet. So what do? You go grind, you go get the crazy materia. Like, just make that stuff happen. Just make it like a part of the story. Fuck, that could be ridiculously cool. So that's my prediction as far as like where they're going to eventually take this, where they can hopefully, if their big grandiose plan goes through, part 3 could be that, you know? But talking about part 2, talking about Rebirth, and we do have to still go over the trailer and sort of break down what happens in the trailer, even though it's not a lot. I think Rebirth is going to be unnecessarily long. I actually do. You have to remember back to what the devs said, right? And when the devs were saying these things, because people are like, oh, they're not going to do what the devs said. That was a long time ago. Bitch, no. Like, the devs, when they were talking about the scale and scope of the game, had said multiple times in interview that they don't want to leave anything out. That is their goal. Their goal with taking this to a certain direction is the fact that they don't want shit to be just gone. They specifically said, as far as a lot of people being concerned at the end of part 1, that, oh, at the end of part 1 that leads into Rebirth, oh my god, dude, we're just gonna go on some weird adventure that doesn't make any sense, and nothing like the original. Kitase literally answered that question a couple years ago, and he said, no, your adventure is going to be very similar to the original Final Fantasy VII. He says, you're still going to hit the same spots and pinpoint the same locations that you had before. It's just that the way they happen will be different, but you're still going to be going there, right? In the same way that, like, the way you run into Yuffie in FF7 Original is going to be different than the way you run into Yuffie in Remake, you know? They're probably going to make her part of the story instead of making her an optional thing. That makes a lot of sense, right? But what is happening with Yuffie? Well, I mean, Yuffie's going to be... Yuffie's still going to be her same old self, you know? She's not going to change that much. She's going to jack all the materia. So the devs directly said that the adventure is going to be pretty similar to what you remember, just more expanded, right? So that leads me to think that, yeah, like, they're still going to have all the things that you sort of remember being there, but once again, how you come across them and what happens to them and during them will be a bit different. So I'm not too worried about that, right? I've seen a lot of threads and people like talking about this stuff and how they're super concerned that, you know, the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 that you're going to be playing is just going to be completely different than what they played before. And I just do not... the devs said specifically that's not what's going to happen. So to me, that's not really a point of concern. I still think we're going to hit all these areas because the devs have had this planned out for like half a decade. And now they're executing on it, you know what I mean? I guess I can tell you my theory on Aerith again. Want me to tell you my theory on Aerith again? Are you ready? Are we ready? My personal theory is that the party is going to actually find out in part 2 about all this timeline shit, right? They're actually going to find out that Aerith had died at some point. That's what I personally think is going to happen. That Cloud is essentially falling in love with her, which happens in the original, and he's getting like premonitions and shit in the same way that he got them. I think there's going to be an implication throughout the story that we can change things, and Aerith is even saying that in the trailer, in the Rebirth trailer. I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, she's even talking about the fact that, oh, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this, and you're gonna learn more stuff about it, how like this stuff can happen, this stuff can't happen. We can change this. Cloud's gonna have this impression like, I can keep you alive. I can save you type of thing. And I think that's great. They're essentially giving the audience an inclination that things will be different. They're essentially building up this entire time. They're giving you all this information that things can change, that the future does change, right? But you learn that it can't. False hope is the narrative. And that's the idea. That in both timelines, I'm going to call it right now, in both timelines, she has to die. Because as much as people think this is cruel and anything like that whenever I talk about it, Aerith dying is the heart of Final Fantasy VII. And in fact, dealing with loss, as we have quite literally reevaluated a lot of what Remake was, as well as Final Fantasy VII was, dealing with loss is essentially the theme of Final Fantasy VII outside of life and the planet, right? The characters are all dealing with some kind of loss in some way and finding ways to cope with it. And in some ways, in some characters like Cloud, the loss that he has dealt with has essentially fucked him up beyond belief, where he now has severe mental issues and is practically diseased by the planet in many ways, where he doesn't know what the hell's going on. That's kind of the point of Final Fantasy VII. And if you play through the original game, it's all over the place when you start really paying attention to every single character. So it's not just Yuffie or this or that or that. It's almost everybody. Maybe Cait Sith doesn't have it a lot, but I think he does, because Cait Sith is also Reeve, who also is dealing with the loss of like the plate falling and all that shit, and how Reeve is now going out of his way to make up for that, right? He's coping with his loss by trying to do something against Shinra, who he's working for. So everyone sort of falls in line with all this crazy stuff. I think there is no way. I think they will build a false hope throughout the whole game that you can save her. I think that's the best way to do it. The characters will be going on all these journeys and finding all this stuff, and even like Aerith will probably be going along with it. But there's always going to be this doubt. There's always going to be this inclination that Aerith knows that this is the only way it has to go. And that's going to be the best fucking part. That's going to be the best part, is that every other character in the party is going to have this false hope. But essentially Aerith like knows. Like, she knows that this is the way it goes down. And she fucking talks about it. She literally talks about it. Isn't that predictable though? Dude, I can't even tell you how many times people keep saying they're going to kill Tifa instead, which literally makes absolutely, she has no connection to the planet. Tifa's death only affects like the party and not the whole world, which is the whole point of Aerith's death. Like, Tifa could be killed 100%, but the implications of her death are not nearly, don't have nearly as much ramifications in the story as the character like Aerith dying. So, what if Cloud dies instead? Yeah, I read that 4chan thread. I like the fact that that 4chan leak thing also took a bunch of shit that I talked about 2 years ago. Yeah, that seemed nice. 4chan leak. Half of the things in the 4chan leak were like little bits and pieces of stuff that I talked about multiple years ago, and then thrown together with the wackiest shit that would just piss people off. Like, in the ways that, like, they did the time Janies in FF7 Part 1, and nobody really liked that, but they literally did that to set up story things that would lead you to seeing a situation where the future of the game is going to be a bit different, right? Where we're not going to have a one-to-one remake. We're going to have something that is relatively unpredictable. That's the whole point of the time Janies, and now they're gone. They are dead, right? They're gone. Plot ghosts are gone. We're not getting them back. We literally killed it. So to me, doing a bunch of shit is the rest of the game everyone is pretty fucking happy with, right? Like, the things that aren't that, people are pretty happy. Why do the complete opposite and do all this ridiculously insane shit that would piss people off? What is part 2 going to be? Right? What's part 2 actually going to entail? Here's my crazy crackpot theory. Are you ready? Are we prepared for this? Are you ready to hear how much shit I think is actually going to be jammed into this game? Because they're hyping it up, right? They're like, yo, guys, we're putting a lot of shit into this. You know, there is so much. This is such a big game that it's crazy. The devs are literally saying this. Granted, they're hyping up their own shit. I get it. I think part 2 is going to be Calm to the Northern Crater. Calling it right now. I think it's Calm. The town of Calm is where it begins, all the way to the Northern Crater, and everything's going to be there. Every single thing in between, from the Chocobo farm to what's it called? To Fort Condor, to Junion, to crossing the ocean, to Mount Corel, to Golden Saucer, to Gongaga, to Red 13's town. That's a lot. It is a lot, right? It definitely seems like a lot. I think the biggest question is, what do they do with that time in between? I think the biggest question is, I think they could still actually make all those towns, because those towns don't have to be huge, right? They could effectively make them the size of sectors, if not even smaller, from Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1. They don't need to be that big. What is in between that shit, right? Like, what is the world map in between that stuff, the zones, right? And that's where I'm like, okay, are they going to be able to do that? Is that enough stuff? Because I'm actually not too worried about the towns. I'm concerned with all the things in between. The little places like the Crystal Caves, right? All that kind of stuff. Because you have to realize, like, if you go back to the original, you breeze by these places. Like, I shit you not, the Crystal Caves is like 3 screens. And that's it, you know? Some of these places are very small. Why do I think that is, right? Why do I think they could actually fit all this development, put all these towns, all these places, all this stuff? And when they're talking about how smooth it's going, right? It's going great. Like, they've been saying this for years now. How could they fit so many locations into a game, as well as a relative large-scale environments in between them? What the hell are they doing to do that? Final Fantasy VII Remake took 5 years to come out before it was revealed, right? I'm sorry, after reveal, it took 5 years for it to eventually show up. So a lot of people are only assuming that this is going to be a very similar situation. Part 2 is going to take a ridiculous amount of time. What people don't account for is that 2.5 years into the development of Final Fantasy VII, they started over. They quite literally dropped the developer and retook the entire project in-house. If you start thinking about, okay, so how long did Square actually get to work on FF7 Remake? Because the game looked a lot different than it did when it first started development in those first trailers. They had about 2.5 years. They put all of FF7 Remake together in like 2.5 to 3 years, as far as like their own conceptualization. It wasn't just like, okay, start making assets, start creating Midgar, Just somebody work on the art here, someone work on the art there. No. Like, the things that happen before that whole cohesive process of making a game takes place is the conceptualization phase of how the hell does the game work? What do we do during the game? How do we plan all this shit out? How do we get people working on this stuff? And how the hell does the combat work? Those parts will take seemingly the longest time to just figure that shit out. It's one of the things that delayed Final Fantasy 15 a ridiculous amount of years, because certain creative parts of Final Fantasy 15 had to have the main character throwing a sword across the entire fucking map and teleporting to it. And then the engineers and the other devs are just like spending fucking years trying to fulfill these requests that just wait, how do we do that with current technology? Well, you have to do it. It just has to be here. And so they've talked about that for years, that it took them that long to get those systems online, right? And granted, Final Fantasy VII Remake doesn't have anything crazy ambitious like that, right? But it does have a battle system that is ridiculously ambitious. It does have an action combat system that works insanely well in the original game. First playthrough, right? Not talking about breaking it. It looks good. It works well. It concepts out great. It's got slowdown. It's got all this really cool cinematic shit in it. It's genuinely like, goddamn, whoever came up with this is a fucking genius. Whoever came up with the way to make it actually work is a fucking genius. The combat in this game is insane. All that shit is figured out. You talking about Rebirth now? All that shit is figured out. They now have a base understanding of how all these systems work. They have a game already in place, right? And now they just have to essentially expand it. We know that part 1 is a corridor-driven linear game that hangs out around one place, Midgar. So now, what is part 2? All about outside of Midgar. We got Yuffie's got better air combat. That's going to be a lot better. We have a combat system that we're probably just going to open up in some way. Most likely the combat system in part 2 is going to involve the PHS, which just allows you to switch any party member at any time. I'm going to call it right now that that's what you're going to get in Rebirth. You just call in. There's 3 characters at any given time, and you can just party switch anybody, right? You can just pop characters in, dual tech, any of that kind of stuff. That's going to be there, man. So, like Final Fantasy X, yeah, but in an action game setting, right? In a Final Fantasy VII setting. The PHS is already like, that's what they'll do. So, what is now the big goal? What is now, like, what is where most of their effort is going with Rebirth? If a lot of the systems are done, what do they have to work on now? And believe it or not, guess what is one of the things that comes online the fastest in a lot of game development? It's art. Is like world stuff, right? Assets. Building assets. Funny enough, the art side and asset side is now the huge part of Final Fantasy VII Remake, Part 2. That is like, how are they going to add all this stuff, right? What all this shit? Well, now they have like a groundwork to set from, which makes a lot of sense why the devs keep saying, oh yeah, no, development is going super smooth. Everything's going great. We're moving at a blitzkrieg pace. That starts to make a lot of sense where everything's just like, and especially if they have good directors and good producers to keep everyone in agreement. Yeah, the systems and the AI and all that stuff, anybody that's actually worked around game development will tell you 100% that shit will completely stop a game from being made sometimes until they figure out or have to change the whole game around it. And what happens when that happens? Sometimes art is just, all the art you made for it is now fucked, right? Because we can't use it anymore. So the foundation's complete and they just have to create a shit ton of things. Create maps, we got to create dungeons, we got to create this, we got to create that, right? And then also, the more important thing, we got to create flow and we have to create pacing and all of that shit, right? Cool, right? I think all of this stuff is extremely relevant for what is possible with Rebirth. Because this is going to be potentially a next-gen game that is fully utilizing Unreal Engine 5 from what is potentially a very early start of development. So part 2, I'm fairly sure, takes place right after, spoilers, Cloud goes missing, the party's disheveled, Meteor's been summoned, Sephiroth has the black materia, Genova's pissed, and now there's giant kaijus walking the planet, destroying everything. I think that's where part 2 ends, you know? I think what happens like post the crater is exactly like the bridge to the next game. And you get a hint that Cloud is still alive, you know? Because a lot of people forget that there's a kind of a big portion of Final Fantasy VII Original where Cloud's dead. It's made by the exact same development team. Very similar to like Chrono Trigger and shit. I didn't play through all of Chrono Trigger, but it's very similar kind of moment where it's assumed that the character is just gone. Yeah, like that's Tifa as the party leader, Tifa's the lead. I think Tifa being the lead is part 3, you know? Will we see Cloud's mom? You actually already did in Remake Part 1. How can Tifa lead if she's dead? How is Tifa possibly gonna lead us if she died earlier, if Sephiroth killed Tifa instead of Aerith, right? That's a great observation.